I want to thank you for joining me in this next series or this next lesson in the book of Isaiah. I'll ask, if you will, to be turning back to chapter 19. We began looking at that section at the end of our last class session together, where we addressed verses 1 through 4. I want to back up and hit those highlights again, and then we'll pick back up in the next section of God's address regarding Egypt as we look at verses 5 through 10 of that same chapter. When you look at this oracle against Egypt, it's basically going to involve two chapters, chapter 19 and chapter 20. And you've got God's message there concerning Egypt. The reason this was such an important lesson for us to see and for Judah to see is because of Egypt's location and because of what Egypt had shown in the past regarding her military prowess. There's going to be a temptation for Judah to join in an alliance with Egypt. That had plagued God's people for some time. I'm in the Minor Prophets now, and we're looking at the book of Hosea, and we see something very similar. There's been a long history of, rather than depending upon God and leaning on the promise, the conditional promise that God made them to care for them, that they often sought a human solution to what they perceived to be a problem through these alliances. At least part of the purpose of Isaiah's proclamation here against Egypt was to show that Egypt is not a powerhouse. As it relates to God, Egypt is indeed small, and we're going to see Egypt's fall here as portrayed prophetically. His pronouncement, his judgment against Egypt is seen in verses 1 through 15 of chapter 9. And we read verses 1 through chapter 19, And we read verses 1 through 4 last time. We won't read that again. We'll pick up our reading of the new material here in just a few moments. But let's go back through and see what's being addressed here in chapter 19. Primarily what we're seeing here in these 4 verses is the internal strife that is going to be experienced, that's going to be seen in Egypt. You know, we talk about nations crumbling from within. That was the case with Rome, as we indicated last week. As is said, Rome fell without a shot being fired. But we do see that internal strife, the internal fighting with one another. How sad to see that we're doing something very similar today. I don't know that we've ever been as divided, maybe except since the times of the Civil War, as a country. We're looking at a country that was pretty much split down the middle in its votes for Joe Biden or for Donald Trump. And so we see a country very split as it regards to ideology as well. We're going to see a major divide today morally and ethically. We're going to see those who have at least promised in their campaign speeches that they're going to try to move this country more toward a communist, they don't use that word, but a communist approach to things. It may very well be that if America is to fall, we're still considered to be one of the strongest, greatest countries in the world today. But if we're going to fall, it's going to largely be because of the internal strife that we're seeing here as we continue to combat one another over these ideological concepts. God is pictured in verse 1 as riding on a swift cloud. Ancients often use that metaphor for their deities as it relates to God traveling. The idols of Egypt would tremble at God's presence. There were some 75 gods that they served. One might think that their attention span or their memory is a little short here, a little lacking. Do they not remember the Exodus, or has that been so long before that it's out of sight, out of mind as it relates to how God manifested his power over their gods through those 10 plagues that were seen in Egypt? Well, God's message for these idolaters is that he's going to incite Egyptians against Egyptians. They're going to turn on one another. It's going to be an internal struggle in that country. According to one commentator, James Henry Breasted said, this was fulfilled historically in the struggles that were going to be seen in these Egyptian dynasties of kings. And that's going to bring about their eventual collapse. Verse 3 indicates this was going to demoralize the Egyptians. In desperation, they're going to again turn to their idols. They're going to look to ghosts of the dead. They're going to look to mediums and spiritualists that Saul had done under similar circumstances. 1 Samuel chapter 28, verses 4 through 20. And then verse 4, the Egyptians will be delivered into the hands of a cruel master. When you look at that terminology again, you're looking at the law of sowing and reaping, or as we might say today, what goes around comes around. Cruel taskmasters were placed over God's people in the book of Exodus to control them. And that's what's going to be placed over Egypt. There's going to be cruel masters. They're going to reap what they sowed in the past. Now, there's really no telling who this is. Historians are split. Some say that it was Sargon II who ruled in 711 BC. Somebody else said that it was Sennacherib who was in 701. Haley, in his commentary, Homer Haley, indicated that it's possible that verse 4 is speaking not of one individual, but the sum of cruel foreign kings who were able to rule over this land. So regardless, we're picking up now where we left off, and we're going to move to a second concept as it related to a judgment against Egypt. And this is going to be seen in verses 5 through 10 regarding the economic collapse that's going to be seen. Let's read that together. The waters will fail from the sea, and the river will be wasted and dried up. The rivers will turn foul. The brooks of defense will be emptied and dried up. The reeds and rushes will wither. The papyrus reeds by the river, by the mouth of the river, and everything sown by the river will wither, be driven away, and be no more. The fishermen also will mourn. All those who lament, who cast hooks into, all those will lament, who cast hooks into the river, and they will languish who spread nets on the waters. Moreover, those who work in fine flax and those who weave fine fabric will be ashamed, and its foundations will be destroyed. All who make wages will be troubled of soul. So we're looking at a time when the economy of that area is basically going to go sour. We've indicated in the past, I mentioned it briefly last week, everything resolved around the Nile as it related to that area there in Egypt. The Nile River Delta butted right up to the southern edge of the Mediterranean Sea. It emptied into the Mediterranean. But everything east, west, and south of that triangle of an oasis, that Nile Delta region, everything else is desert. And so you're looking at a country that based its livelihood on the overflowing of the Nile in the rainy season. You're going to see things were lush, things were green. It was a very fruitful place. They made their living off the fish. Remember that the Egyptians had basically placed a god over that. When you look at the water being turned into blood, and you're looking at the fish and everything dying, you're seeing God's mastery over the gods that were invented, if you will, and placed over, watching over those areas. So you're looking at a very idolatrous country whose financial well-being rose and fell as it related to the Nile. But here we see an economic collapse that results from a lack of water from the Nile. That's verses 5 and 6 that we just read. People in all areas of work. Remember, so many things were tied to that, whether it was storing or buying or selling or gathering or cooking or whatever. You're looking at so many things that were basically dependent upon that which the Nile River produced in that area. And they were very rich. Remember that in the book of Genesis, and Joseph saw 7 years of plenty followed by 7 years of famine. When you look at the 7 years of plenty, there were storehouses filled with all of that good. But also when you see the famine that came on the land, everybody else but primarily Egypt and Pharaoh were dependent upon what Egypt was able to store up. In other words, so many areas of life are going to come to an end. They're going to come to a screeching halt because the Nile is going to be affected. Egypt was dependent upon those annual Nile floods for their well-being. Cairo really only receives about 2 inches of rain per year. So where other people are dependent upon rain and may get abundant rain, that wasn't the case there. It was the Nile that was their key. Oswald, a commentator, said, without the Nile, there would be no Egypt. And that's one of the things that's being portrayed here. When you look at verse 10, the pillars of Egypt would be crushed. And that may very well refer to the idols or the obelisks that were erected by the kings and by the nobles throughout the land. Others, like Haley, see this as symbol for honesty and virtue, purity and goodness. Another sees working class. So there's a lot of differing views here. And so we have some very general statements being made. It's probably some sense of idolatry that is being seen, because that's often the problem as it relates to God's judgment upon these other nations. You see their internal corruption, you see a lack of morality, you see a rejection of God, and you see an elevation of idols. And so these things are going to go down. If they trusted in their idols to be blessing them through those things, then those are things that very well may be crushed to show that they're not going to have that power. Egypt, in holding to these idols, just as Israel and Judah are going to be referenced throughout this book. If you reject God and you hold up these idols, they're going to be crushed. They're going to be exposed as being inept. And then another collapse is seen in verses 11 through 15, and that is a political collapse. Let's read that together. Surely the princes of Zoan are fools. Pharaoh's wise counselors give foolish counsel. How do you say to Pharaoh, I am the son of the wise, the son of ancient kings? Where are they? Where are your wise men? Let them tell you now, and let them know what the Lord of hosts has purposed against Egypt. The princes of Zoan have become fools. The princes of Noph are deceived. They have also deluded Egypt, those who are the mainstay of its tribes. The Lord has mingled a perverse spirit in her midst, and they have caused Egypt to err in all her work. As a drunken man staggers in his vomit, neither will there be any work for Egypt, which the head or tail, palm or bulrush may do. So you're looking at internal strife. You're looking at economic collapse that's going to characterize God's judgment against Egypt. And finally here, we're looking at the political collapse that's seen in the verses 11 through 15 here that we just read. First of all, there in verse 11, he says, the princes of Zoan are fools. Zoan was situated on the south shore of a lake at the northeastern edge of the Egyptian delta. Other names for this city have been Tanis, Avaris, and quite possible Ramses. This was a city that was built 7 years after Hebron, Numbers chapter 13 and verse 22. This is the area known as Goshen. That's the area that we're talking about here that's being addressed. And we're talking about these princes of this area are being addressed at this point. Well, remember that Egypt was well known down through the years for its wisdom literature. Remember much later than this, about another 500 years, as a matter of fact. We're going to see Alexandria being a city where there was a library. 332 BC, Alexander the Great conquered the world and Hellenized the world. And he brought with him a lot of wisdom and education and writing and literature. And so that would characterize all of these later. Remember, the Septuagint version, a Greek translation of the Hebrew text, was produced about 250 BC and was placed in the library at Alexandria. But that's not when it began. Already in the days of Isaiah, as he's speaking of this, they were already well known for this wisdom literature, and it's one of the many things upon which they prided themselves in that culture. The language used here shows that these people were thick-headed. They were stubborn, obstinate, as it related to various things. Even as Isaiah addresses here, even the wisest of Pharaoh's counsel had become stupid, is the language that's being used. That's not a nice word, but that very, very well characterizes what's happening in Egypt at this time. Those who refuse to have God in their knowledge are going to be led away by their own delusion. We need to remember that God wants everyone to follow him. God is not willing that any should perish, 2 Peter 3:9, but that all should come to repentance. There's a New Testament passage that speaks about the nature of God that's been going on since the inception of the world, since the creation of the world and mankind. God does not want anyone to reject him. Matthew 23:37. He wanted to gather them together, but they weren't willing. And in their unwillingness, it wasn't just a matter of indifference. It was a matter of stubbornness. They flat out refused to acknowledge God, to heed God. They elevated their own wisdom. And in that sense, they had become ignorant. They had become stupid in their approach. These leaders were all deluded by foolish counsel. We see these kings often had a court. I think of Nebuchadnezzar, and I think of when Nebuchadnezzar had his dream, that he called for those to come in and tell him what the dream was and what it meant. But he was just one in a line of many. That was standard practice, to have those that a leader could look to for advice on how to deal with the situation. Sometimes good advice was given. Gamaliel in Acts chapter 5. He was approached by the Jews of that day, wondering what they were going to do about Jesus and his followers. Jesus had already died, was buried, and had been resurrected, but his followers were around, and the church was growing in leaps and bounds. And so the Jews basically consulted Gamaliel and asked what to do about that. And Gamaliel basically recalled two people and the followers that followed them in the past. Both of those had come up, they had gained followers, and then it had kind of just fizzled away. And what he said was, if this group of people calling themselves disciples is like that, then let's just sit back and watch, and this will fade away, this will fizzle out, and we won't have to worry about it. But if they are who they claim to be, if they are disciples of the Son of God, then do they really want to find themselves fighting against God in that situation? You see, he gave great advice, and they followed that. Now, as it related to them, yeah, the church continued to grow, but they would indeed have found themselves fighting against God if they had taken the approach that some wanted to take and just wipe these people out. We go back to this situation now. Those wise men of this area had become ignorant. They'd become stupid. And what it means by that is they were giving bad advice. They were giving counsel that was not good. And so you've got pharaohs who are acting on words that are unsound and are unwise. The pitiful condition that's described here. Let's look at verse 15 again. Neither will there be any work for Egypt, which the head or tail, branch, palm branch, or bulrush may do. You're looking at a total collapse. When God decided to step in and to bring this punishment against Egypt, it's going to fail. They're going to be infighting. They're going to suffer in their economy. They're politically, they're going to collapse. All of these things are indicated as truths that's going to happen because God had already decided to bring his judgment against Egypt because of what they had done. Now, how was God going to do that? Now in verses 16 through 25, we see God's plan as it relates to bringing about this demise. Now, we're going to read that here in just a few moments. But let's note that as we're moving through here, we're going to highlight 5 paragraphs in this revelation of God's plan of what he's going to do to Egypt. We're going to see 5 paragraphs, short paragraphs, and each one of them is going to begin the same way. It's going to begin with the phrase, "in that day." Here we have God announcing his plan. It moves from the judgment against Egypt that has been spoken of, now also to the promise of redemption for Egypt and the world. Now, I wanted to say this before we move into reading that text. I find it so fascinating that people attempt to separate the attributes of God and try to indicate that there was a God of the Old Testament and a God of the New. Oftentimes people categorize the God of the Old Testament, and that's where they put the wrath, the hatred, the sin, the punishment, all of these things. They say that's the Old Testament God, and that characterized the Old Testament. And then they try to say, but however, the New Testament God is different. The New Testament God is God of mercy and love and peace and grace. People do that to their own failure. How dare we try to pigeonhole God into acting differently and having different attributes in different points in time? If we look at the fact that God is going to punish Egypt, and we're going to see destruction, we're going to see gloom, we're going to see doom, that might play into the hands of those who say, well, yeah, that's the God of the Old Testament. But we're also going to look, God also is going to promise redemption. Even through this difficulty, we see a sense of hope being spoken of. But wait a minute, that's only in the God of the New Testament. You see, that's where people err in trying to make these designations of God. Okay, let's go ahead and read now verses 16 through 25, and then we're going to break down these individual paragraphs and see what they have to say as we have time. In that day, Egypt will be like women and will be afraid and fear because of the waving of the hand of the Lord of hosts, which he waves over it. And the land of Judah will be a terror to Egypt. Everyone who makes mention of it will be afraid in himself because of the counsel of the Lord of hosts, which he has determined against it. In that day, 5 cities in the land of Egypt will speak the language of Canaan and swear by the Lord of hosts. One will be called the city of destruction. In that day, there will be an altar to the Lord in the midst of the land of Egypt, and a pillar to the Lord at its border. And it will be for a sign and for a witness to the Lord of hosts in the land of Egypt. For they will cry to the Lord because of the oppressors, and he will send them a Savior and a mighty one, and he will deliver them. Then the Lord will be known to Egypt, and the Egyptians will know the Lord in that day, and will make sacrifice and offerings. Yes, they will make a vow to the Lord and perform it. And the Lord will strike Egypt. He will strike and heal it. They will return to the Lord, and he will be entreated by them and heal them. In that day there will be a highway from Egypt to Assyria, and the Assyrian will come into Egypt, and the Egyptian into Assyria, and the Egyptians will serve with the Assyrians. In that day Israel will be one of 3 with Egypt and Assyria, a blessing in the midst of the land, whom the Lord of hosts shall bless, saying, Blessed is Egypt, my people, and Assyria the work of my hands, and Israel my inheritance. Well, we're only going to have time to basically just get started. We've got about 5 minutes left in our time today. Looking first of all at verses 16 and 17. Now I want to reread these verses as we go through to get the context. We're looking at the Egyptians being terrified. In that day, Egypt will be like women and will be afraid and fear because of the waving of the hand of the Lord of hosts, which he waves over it. And the land of Judah will be a terror to Egypt. Everyone who makes mention of it will be afraid in himself because of the counsel of the Lord of hosts, which he has determined against it. Horrifying situation. Trembling, fear, terror, dread are all words that will identify the feeling, the emotions of that day. That's going to all be expressed by the Egyptians in this judgment of God. The wrath of God upon the evildoer is obvious. I'm afraid to some degree we have lost a sense of awe with God today. Oftentimes we see God as a kind, sweet old grandfather who all he wants to do is love and show affection to his people. We see a merciful God. We see a gracious God. We see a God of love. All those things are true. But I believe we've lost a sense of terror as well as to what's going to happen. There is going to be a judgment at the end. If we die before the Lord returns, we're going to be judged, and we're going to reside either in paradise or in Hades. And it's a terrible thing. I know a lot of people who have attempted to show that there is no such thing as hell anymore. We have some of the cults who basically practice a belief of soul sleep, that when we die, we just die and that's it. F. LaGard Smith, a brother in Christ, has written a book where, in essence, he took the same position. And when I think about that, I think we do that to our detriment. I think we remove a healthy sense of fear and dread for those things. Should we live our life based in terror, fear, and dread? No. But if we're living a life that is characterized as living outside of a relationship of God, judgment is due. And judgment is going to be harsh, and it's going to be severe. We're living in a day when people seem to want us to be more PC from our pulpits. They don't want to talk about hell. They don't want to talk about punishment. They don't want to talk about writhing in pain the way that hell is portrayed. But it should be a healthy fear. I should know that that is what God is going to do. That's not why I follow him. I should not want to follow him just to avoid eternal torment. I should follow him because I love him. But motivation can take different forms. And another form of motivation can be remembering what God has shown of himself as it relates to how he's going to treat those who reject his will. As much as we try to tame him down in our approach of him, as much as we try to be more PC in our approach to proclaiming his will, we need to keep that in account. You know, Paul indicated that he had preached the whole counsel. I mentioned that there in the book of Acts. There was no dread of him. He had no conscience problem. He told them everything they needed to hear. And likewise, we need to preach the whole counsel today. We don't need to have a steady diet of gloom and doom. We don't need to have a steady diet of negativity. But we need to balance what is said about the positive and the negative of our faith, the positive and negative of what we can expect to happen because of the very nature of God. Well, we're going to stop there today. We'll pick back up in verse 18 next week and look at this second paragraph, the second aspect as it relates to God's plan for Egypt. Thank you again for joining us. I'm hoping that this study is beneficial to you. I'm hoping that you're taking these lessons, that you want to dig even deeper to learn more of these lessons from this time. But until next week, God bless you.